During university, I pretended to be poor and seduced a mechanic. I liked to call him daddy, and I would cuddle up to him and ask for kisses on his flushed neck. But it turned out he was an underworld master suffering from amnesia. I was so scared that I ran away in the dead of night. Several years later, we crossed paths again. The man, now elegant and noble, rolled up his sleeves and systematically blocked all my escape routes. Trembling, I called out to him, "Steve." Steve lowered his head, pinched my neck teasingly, and asked with a playful smile, "Why aren't you calling me daddy anymore?" Little trickster, if you want to deceive, do it for longer, don't give up halfway. After returning to my home country, my best friend Rebecca arranged a welcome banquet for me. She even invited some male models, all with broad shoulders and slender waists, and with lips red and teeth white. They called me sister one after another, making me feel dizzy, and with a wave of a hand, they ordered 3 champagne towers. They laughed even more brightly. After a few rounds of drinks, I urgently needed to use the restroom. Covering my not-so-clear head, I walked unsteadily towards the bathroom. In the dim light, I didn't notice and bumped straight into a pair of scorching arms. The man let out a muffled groan, sounding somewhat familiar. His scent was also familiar, the scent of my favorite oud wood and agarwood. Cold, aloof, just like my ex-boyfriend. As I cursed myself and thought of that troublemaker, I slowly took a few steps back. "Sorry," I said. The man didn't say a word. But the powder foundation smudges on his black suit made him look increasingly comical. Feeling embarrassed, I decided to take a stack of red bills from my wallet and stuff them into his pocket. "Take it for dry cleaning, the money's on me." As my fingertips crossed his lean waist, I secretly marveled at his perfection. The next moment, my wrist was tightly gripped, and a hot breath scorched my skin. A familiar deep voice with a hint of amusement sounded, "Coco, do you want to look up and see who I am?" That voice, blowing away the drunkenness, made me shiver involuntarily. I took a deep breath and slowly raised my head. The aggressive face with raised eyebrows, wild and untamed, entered my sight. It was the daunting underworld master, Steve. The same Steve I charmed while pretending to be poor 3 years ago. It felt like a ghost encounter. Slapping my flushed face, I pretended to be in a drunken haze and mumbled, "Who's talking to me?" "I'm drunk, I can't hear anything clearly." Seizing the opportunity, I freed myself from his restraint and bolted. Steve followed leisurely, like a patient wolf. Soon enough, I understood why he seemed so relaxed. I despairingly gazed at the cold, towering wall in front of me, feeling like my days were numbered. What respectable family member runs away and ends up in a dead-end alley, Coco? When Steve called out to me, the end of his voice slightly rose, sounding intimate. A shiver crawled down my spine, sensing that I was being targeted like prey. My legs felt weak, and I turned around laboriously. That's when I saw the elegant and noble man rolling up his sleeves, systematically blocking all my escape routes. At this point, I knelt down involuntarily, trembling as I called out to him, "Steve." The scent of oud wood surrounded me even more. Along with Steve's almost overflowing pheromones, the air around me grew warmer. Finding it hard to breathe, his scorching hand lightly brushed against the skin behind my ear before Steve lowered his head, pinching my neck teasingly, and said with a playfully wicked smile, "Why aren't you calling me daddy anymore?" Little trickster, if you're going to deceive, deceive for longer, don't give up halfway. Remembering the past, my face suddenly blushed. Steve, at that time, was still an innocent and restrained mechanic. Wearing the standard work pants, a white t-shirt hugging his smooth muscles, and a slightly fierce demeanor when not smiling. But he was undeniably handsome. Being captivated by his looks, I packaged myself as a girl from humble beginnings who still harbored big dreams. It didn't take long for him to fall for it. Once the relationship was established, I became more fearless, enjoying calling him daddy and cuddling up to his flushed neck for kisses. Steve couldn't resist. His eyes showed increasing affection towards me with each passing day. Until one day, I found the signet ring hidden in his cabinet. Wasn't this the token of the Smiths? Could Steve be the underworld master who disappeared after being betrayed? Rumors had it that he was ruthless and detested being deceived. When he regains his memory, he would probably torture me. Moreover, I had also hurt his most important family member. Thinking of this, my heart trembled, and I packed up and left in the dead of night. That escape lasted for 3 years. Warm fingertips kneaded my lips, forcing me to snap back to reality. Steve asked me softly, Coco, are you still running? His eyes, like a harbinger of an unfathomable storm, made me feel a rare chill. I took a deep breath and, feigning slight drunkenness, I replied, not running. I fear you might end me. Exhaling hot breath as our lips moved apart, Steve's eyes darkened as he withdrew his hand abruptly. Suddenly, he chuckled, don't worry, I won't end you, I will only. Those 3 words made my ears turn red with the forced calmness. Though maintaining a calm and composed demeanor, Steve continued to exude a playful aura. Coco, come back with me. He reached out his hand towards me, his eyes brimming with desire. Instinctively, I took a step back. Steve's eyes grew deeper, attempting to grab my wrist. Making a quick decision, I wriggled up from under his arm. However, my attempt to escape was short-lived as Steve grabbed me by the nape of the neck. Like catching a small animal, he hoisted me over his shoulder. I kicked and struggled, trying to break free from his strong grip. With no intention to budge, Steve casually teased me, don't move around, I don't want to do this here. My face turned pale, and I muttered, who cares where you want to do it? Frowning, feeling somewhat fed up, I muttered with a muffled voice, Steve, you're pressing on my stomach. I need to go to the toilet. Steve's expression turned dark as he shoved me into the ladies' room. The sound of the exhaust fan echoed as I washed my hands, staring blankly at the nearby window. Run or not run, recalling Steve's intensely burning eyes, I made a split-second decision. Run. My life is more important. After drying my hands, I took a running start and leaped onto the windowsill. Outside, there was an alley with few people passing by. It would take Steve at least 5 minutes to catch up. In the corner, there was lush vegetation, enough to protect me from harm. Taking a deep breath to bolster my courage, driven by the longing for freedom, I jumped down. Landing in a familiar warm embrace, surrounded again by the scent of oud wood, which now arrogantly claimed all my senses. It was Steve. Had he installed radar on me? Every grab was on point. Steve raised an eyebrow. Toilet? Even though his demeanor seemed relaxed, my internal alarm bells were going off frantically. My intuition told me that if I told the truth, things would end even worse for me. I struggled desperately. It's a bit warm, I need some fresh air. Steve glanced at me and then took off his scarf, tying it around my neck. The warmth of the scarf, heated by his body temperature, pressed against my cold skin, sending a sudden shiver through me. His actions were gentle, giving me a false sense that this incident had been left in the past. Just as I let out a sigh of relief, Steve pulled out a card from my pocket and chuckled oddly. Is it because it's hot? The card, written in a casual manner, read, thanks to Miss Coco for the champagne tower. Looking forward to seeing you again. With the cartoon muscle man in the corner. Unable to meet Steve's gaze, I edged toward the exit. This is something I can explain. They don't know what was done to my hands, causing me to involuntarily point at a card. I tried to summon a fragile smile, hoping to evoke Steve's pity. It was a trick that had never failed me 3 years ago. 3 years later, in a whirlwind of events, Steve lifted me up. He effortlessly subdued all my struggles, gazing at me intensely and huskily stating, Coco, an unruly child deserves punishment. He laid me back on the bed. As soon as I lost his restraint, I immediately wanted to move away from Steve, feeling that something was off. But he grabbed me by the ankle, pulling me back with force. Once again enveloped by his tall figure, leaving no room for escape, Steve knelt beside me, scrutinizing me inch by inch, like a wild beast surveying its territory. His eyes seemed to be evaluating me like a predatory animal. Steve, I called out, my voice trembling. Having made several attempts and failed, I was beginning to regret and wish to go back and punish myself. Steve glanced at me, nonchalantly reaching for his belt. I shut my eyes tightly. He found it insufficient and chuckling lightly, he grabbed my hand and placed it on top, the cold metal against my scorching palm. Steve whispered seductively, Coco, come on, undo it. His throaty voice, enveloped in an undeniable desire, made my face flush with heat and my mind grow hazy. Afraid? Steve's trailing tone carried a hint of amusement. Who's afraid? In Coco's dictionary, there's only surrender, not fear. Fueled by my competitive spirit, I fought back. Continue, who's afraid? We're not little dogs. As we worked together, the belt was undone and tossed on the ground with a crisp sound. Amid Steve's low chuckles, my ears tingled lightly. Struggling to suppress the rapidly rising heart in my throat, I pretended to be composed and reached out to touch his abdominal muscles. 8 perfect abs, not too much, not too little, warm, supple, and springy when slightly pressed. Coco, no more touching. Steve's voice brought me back to reality. I suddenly came to my senses and realized that under the dim light, Steve had a restrained look with a hint of surprising redness at the corners of his eyes. I hesitated for a moment before stammering, "Are you scared?" Steve, on the other hand, responded readily, "Yes, I am scared." He leaned down and whispered softly in my ear. I blushed even to my neck. Who taught him to be so good at this? Just 3 years ago, he was so shy that he would blush furiously from just a little teasing. His laughter made me a bit annoyed. I tried to pull my hand back, but he pressed it back and kissed me. He called me by my nickname, Coco, good girl. Steve's breath dominated all my senses. I was intoxicated by his kiss when suddenly a warm tingling sensation surged in my lower abdomen. I hesitated, grabbing the hand he had placed on my thigh. "Wait." "Huh?" Meeting his dark gaze, I nervously said, "Steve, I know you are eager, but don't be hasty. I think I might be getting my period." When I came out of the shower, Steve had already changed the bedsheets stained with blood. I felt a bit embarrassed. Actually, I could have done it myself. Steve handed me a cup of steaming ginger tea with brown sugar and took out a hairdryer to dry my hair. He smiled faintly. "I've been doing it for you before, it's all right. Isn't it a bit late for you to say this now?" I was speechless for a moment. The Steve from 3 years ago was not only pure but also very considerate. Knowing that I wasn't feeling well, he tolerated all my quirks. He washed my dirty clothes, bought me painkillers, and even cooked seafood porridge to warm my stomach. But the current him was no match for the Steve of 3 years ago. The porridge he cooked might have been filled with poison. I wisely changed the subject. "How did you end up at the bar tonight?" The warm wind blew through our hair. Steve continued his actions without stopping. After a certain little cheat cleaned me out, she left me and ran away. Finally, when she came back, of course I had to ask her why. He chuckled with a hint of coldness. Unexpectedly, not only did she feel no guilt, but she also had the mood to party with someone else. He gritted his teeth. I felt a chill in my spine, almost wanting to cry. That little Rebecca has done so much harm. I don't know when the sound of the hairdryer stopped. I raised my head nervously. In the unusually silent room, a silent storm brewed in the depths of Steve's eyes. Yet his face remained calm as he calmly asked me, "Coco, why did you run away?" Moonlight poured in from the window. In the shifting light and shadow, Steve lowered his gaze to me like a beast choosing its prey. I swallowed hard. "It's a long story." He smiled, "Then make it short. There's still a long night ahead, and I have the patience to wait for you to finish." With his intimidating demeanor, I found it bitter to speak. The deliberate suppression of the truth surged in my mind, weighing heavily on my heart, making it hard for me to utter even a jest. If Steve knew that his sister's death was related to me, would he not only find our past relationship 3 years ago disgusting, but also detest it to the core? As I struggled to hold on, the butler suddenly knocked on the door. "Steve, Kathy is here." Kathy, the woman chosen by the Smiths to be Steve's wife. I had returned from abroad only after receiving this news. Steve didn't respond, but instead kept his gaze fixed on my face with a cold expression. We stood in silence. He was waiting for my answer. I pinched my palm, whispered softly, "You go ahead. I'll tell you when you come back. When he wants to settle scores, that will be fine. It was me who had wronged him in the first place. I not only deceived his feelings, but also avoided the truth like a coward." Steve touched the mole near my eye and whispered softly, "Coco, don't worry, I will not marry her. I will only be with the one I love." Whether before or after amnesia, Steve had always been reserved, rarely expressing his feelings. It was the first time he had been so open about his feelings. I should have been happy. But the thought of his sister's death sent a chill through me. I forced a smile and pushed him away. "Okay, I'll be waiting for you." Kathy was indeed as glamorous as the rumors said. She had a short, neat haircut, and her fitted blue and white motorcycle suit emphasized her bold and confident demeanor. Carrying a helmet, Kathy looked up at me on the second floor and suddenly smiled. "Who's this little beauty?" Steve's expression darkened as he stepped forward, firmly placing me behind him. "You don't need to know." His serious and warning appearance was rarely seen, and it was quite intimidating. Kathy rolled her eyes. "If you don't want to say, then don't." "Why so mean?" If it wasn't for the trouble at the dock, do you think I would willingly come to find you? Steve's expression softened slightly. He squeezed my hand, planting a kiss on my forehead. Coco, wait for me. Ignoring Steve's icy gaze, Kathy blew a whistle. Before leaving, she defiantly boarded the driver's seat with Steve staring daggers at her as he sat in the back. What, Steve, do you think I'm your chauffeur? Kathy cursed as she started the engine. The roar of the sports car faded into the night. The butler, who had unknowingly approached me, sighed. It's been a while since I've seen the young master so emotional. After Miss Shirley's death, he sealed himself off. I lowered my gaze and looked at the patterns on the floor. Circles within circles, like shackles from which one could never escape. Can you tell me about Steve's sister? I sniffled softly. I never met her. Steve's sister, Shirley, was not favored by the Smiths. Her mother had been the beloved daughter of Steve's grandfather, but broke ties with the family for a man. For a long time, their family became the subject of ridicule within high society. It wasn't until years later that Shirley's mother discovered her husband's affair. Unable to bear it, she murdered her husband and then committed suicide, leaving behind her 5-year-old daughter. In that blood-stained room, Steve carried Shirley, who had been hidden in the closet. The door wasn't completely closed, and her small face still had splatters of blood. Shirley neither cried nor laughed. She numbly twisted her fingers. And so, she became Steve's sister. But within the Smiths, protecting a little girl was too difficult. Not to mention the evident disgust Steve's grandfather felt towards Shirley. After Steve disappeared due to a conspiracy, they turned their madness towards targeting Shirley to appease Steve's grandfather. The butler suddenly asked me, "Do you know how they treated Shirley?" A horrifying suspicion began to form in my mind. She was only 12 years old when they sent her to various high officials' homes. At that time, Steve had disappeared, his parents had passed away, and there was no one to help Shirley. She eventually succumbed to depression and died by cutting her wrists in the bathtub. The butler's face showed deep sorrow. I clenched my fists, struggling to find the words. No, I could have saved her. If that night I hadn't attended the party, I wouldn't have missed Shirley's messages, and I wouldn't have missed her calls. How devastated she must have been, to place all her hopes on a sister she had known only for less than half a year online. After dialing 5 times without an answer, she resolutely chose death. Before she passed away, she left a message thanking me for 6 months of companionship. Thank you for introducing me to a beautiful world, but I can't bear it anymore. I'm in so much pain. If you have the time, could you come to my city and bring me some flowers? Though her address was vague, I still recognized it as the Smiths' mansion. Shortly after, Shirley's death made headlines across the news. So, when I discovered that Steve was not only an underworld master but also the older brother Shirley relied on the most, I was almost overwhelmed. I had no idea how to face him. Crossing almost half of America, I attended the little girl's funeral and brought her favorite daisies. Soft yet resilient, just like her. A few months later, Steve reappeared in public view. He had changed drastically, using force to cleanse the Smiths and seizing power while his grandfather's health deteriorated. And there I was, in a foreign land, watching him on the screen, now deep and mysterious, feeling lost. I waited for Steve all night, but he never came. Instead, Rebecca called me. "Could you at least tell me before you leave? Do you know how scared I was this morning when I woke up and couldn't find you?" "I thought those thugs had abducted you," I apologetically replied. "Steve came to see me, and I didn't have time to tell you." Rebecca was also aware of this tangled relationship. She paused, cautiously asked me, "So, you're alive, right?" I chuckled bitterly. "For now. The future is uncertain." Rebecca snorted. "As long as you're not dead now, come over quickly. We need you here." She was always carefree, so hearing her say this meant something significant had happened. I transcribed the novel content and translated it into English. I turned the draft I worked on all night into a letter and placed it on Steve's pillow. I didn't send a message because I was afraid of his sudden coldness. "I guess I can delay it for another day." I sighed and grabbed my bag, heading to the office. When I arrived, Rebecca was anxiously pulling her hair. Over the past 2 years, she and I had started a small company, and most of the profits went to support underprivileged girls. We hadn't lost money so far. She placed the documents in front of me. The investors were pulling out their investment in us due to a strategic shift. I was stunned. Did it have to be by the end of the year? Rebecca nodded despondently. Without this funding, not only can we not pay salaries next spring, but we might have to stop the aid as well. Rebecca, we can't stop the aid. I pinched my eyebrows, feeling a headache coming on. I had to pay the school fees next semester, and without money, they wouldn't even be able to attend school. Rebecca slumped on the table. What should we do? I had put my private money into it. Do you have any left? I did have some, but it wasn't enough. I also leaned on the table, sighed deeply. If all else fails, I'll go seek investment. It sounds easy to say, but after busily working for a few weeks in the dark, I finally made my way to a drinking party, feeling a bit hesitant that the first investor was introduced by my parents, and discussing cooperation was a breeze. But now, I had to rely on myself. I took a deep breath, smiled, and greeted everyone, adjusting the hem of my skirt. Isn't this Miss Coco? Just as beautiful as the rumors suggest. Miss Coco, may I have the honor of buying you a drink? Various scrutinizing and teasing gazes converged on me, some of which made me uncomfortable. I downed a drink, barely managing the dizziness, trying to start introducing the company. To my surprise, more glasses were pushed in front of me. With blurry vision, their faces twisted like evil spirits. I pinched my palm, sorry. The man closest to me put his hand on my shoulder, giving it a suggestive touch, saying, Miss Coco, if you don't drink this glass, it's like disrespecting us. If you keep this attitude, we might have to reconsider the cooperation you're talking about. I had never encountered this situation before. But thinking about Rebecca, who I was supporting with all my might, I gritted my teeth and drank another glass. The room was already spinning, and I leaned on the table, continuously trying to calm myself down by taking deep breaths. After dodging suggestive touches several times, the venue suddenly fell silent for a moment. The next second, it burst into excitement. Steve, why are you here? Please sit down. The main seat is reserved for you. The businessman who had been trying to get me drunk hastily ran to flatter him, leaving only one or two persistent ones who wanted to get me drunk. I covered my head, looked up, and saw Steve in a finely tailored ash gray suit, looking remarkably sharp and detached. It had been 2 or 3 weeks since we last saw each other, and he seemed to have lost some weight, his jawline even sharper, with a sense of cold detachment that suddenly dawned on me. We hadn't been in touch since the last time we parted ways. Perhaps sensing my gaze, he turned his head and looked at me. Steve. My voice got stuck in my throat, and I couldn't make a sound. Because in Steve's eyes as he looked at me, there was clear disdain and indifference, making me feel a chill all over my body. A soft thud. The glass in my hand fell to the ground, making a dull sound. Steve turned back. Casually responding to the flattery of the others, I tried to decently leave, but ended up being pushed in his direction. Steve, isn't Miss Coco beautiful? You let a bit of your resources slip through your fingers, and she would do anything to get your approval. Our hard work, Rebecca's and mine, was degraded and mocked by them. Shamelessly wearing tinted glasses, they speculated about me and implied things. Feeling isolated and helpless, I trembled with anger. Watching a cold Steve, the sense of being wronged swept over me like a raging storm. Coco. He glanced at me indifferently, chuckling softly, indeed beautiful, but not the type I like. How could this delicate, easily broken tufted flower compare with Kathy? I was stunned. His affectionate words from that night still echoed in my ears. Coco, don't worry, I won't marry her. I'll only be with the one I like. Hatred toward someone indeed could be so obvious. I suddenly felt a bit unsteady. I forced a smile, picked up the glass next to me, and emptied it in one go. Here's to Steve and Kathy, a long and happy life. Steve's eyes darkened slightly. Just as I was about to turn away, he spoke up. If Miss Coco can drink all these glasses, I'm willing to invest in you. Looking in the direction he gestured, I saw a full table of glasses not far away. Under the light, they glimmered with a cold light. The people around us quickly started to cheer. My face turned pale as I, unbelieving, looked at him. Steve knew my drinking capacity. He knew that if I drank too much, the next day my whole body would be covered with a rash itching to the bone. Yet he still made me drink, even putting me in this difficult situation. What, Miss Coco, afraid now? Steve raised an eyebrow, giving a cold smirk. The same words now sounded entirely different. Okay. I pushed down the bitterness in my heart, smiled, and thought, it's just drinking, right? I hope Steve does what he said. Out of the corner of my eye, I seemed to see his lips tighten a bit. The upscale banquet served decades-old vintage red wines. They were supposed to be incredibly fragrant and clear, yet glass after glass, I couldn't taste a hint of aroma. Instead, bitterness and spiciness burned my throat, making me almost want to cry. By the third glass, a slender hand pressed on the rim of the glass. Steve frowned, clearly disapproving of my miserable state. "Enough, Miss Coco, go wash your face." Stop feeling dizzy, I protested. "I haven't finished yet." He said as long as I could finish, he would invest in me. If I couldn't, no one else would consider working with me. I said it's enough, and it truly was. Steve's tone suddenly turned cold. "You can rest assured, I'll send my assistant to coordinate with you." The heavy weight lifted off my chest. I almost fled to the bathroom. I hadn't eaten dinner and had already downed a bunch of alcohol, causing my delicate stomach to ache like a lump of iron. The intense nausea persisted even after escaping the smoky ambience of the venue. After enduring the worst discomfort, I somewhat cleared my head, wiped my face with water roughly, and stepped out of the bathroom. But at the corner, I bumped straight into Steve. He didn't know how long he had been waiting. Upon hearing my footsteps, he turned his head, his gaze still cold. "Steve," I muttered, holding back tears, apologizing. In those eyes that used to be my favorite, there was nothing but coldness now. He pulled his mouth. "You should say that to Shirley, not me." Shirley was the scar standing between us. I self-mockingly smiled, feeling a bit like crying. "Steve, you must hate me to death, right?" This judgment, delayed for 3 years, had finally arrived. Steve paused for a moment, then sneered, "Coco, it's pointless to hate you." He lit a cigarette, and the rising smoke shrouded his face. "Don't appear in front of me anymore." His voice was weary, as if talking about the weather, speaking the coldest words. The pungent scent of smoke invaded my nostrils, and in my discomfort, I pinched my palm, unable to resist the urge to gag. Steve cursed under his breath. When he looked up again, the cigarette he just lit was abruptly smashed into the trash can by the host. The wafting smoke lingered, and he quickly withdrew his hand as if burnt. A bold fantasy emerged in my mind. Almost hoping against hope, I stammered out a question, one word at a time. "Steve, do you still love me?" The air suddenly fell silent. Steve furrowed his brows. "Does it matter if I love you or not?" The ground suddenly quietened. Steve raised his eyebrows. "I don't want to answer this boring question. I don't want to see you anymore. You better stay away from me, understand?" I was imprisoned within the confines of that moment, forced to tilt my head up. But I still smiled. "Steve, is it so hard to say you don't love someone?" "Don't worry, if you say you don't love me, I will never bother you again." A crack seemed to form in the icy lake in his eyes, revealing an emotion I couldn't decipher. After a pause, he coldly said, "I don't love you." Steve's figure slowly disappeared from view. I leaned against the cold porcelain wall, feeling my strength ebbing away. After a while, I covered my face, laughing and crying. He wasn't good at lying. Saying he didn't love me, yet his eyes revealed reluctance. "Steve, do you truly not love me?" "I don't believe it." Rebecca heard about the incident at the dinner party and asked me what I was thinking. I had taken some medicine delivered by someone for dinner last night, and now, with a radiant face, I began to face my feelings head-on. I have always been slow to understand matters of the heart. And Steve is extremely reserved. We never even said "I love you" during the 3 years we were together. I had thought that our relationship was merely based on physical attraction. So in the face of this invisible barrier, I chose to avoid him and let him go. Until the night we reunited, Steve presented his true feelings to me, saying he would only be with someone he liked. My heart started pounding like a drum. I finally realized that I had already fallen in love with him. Throughout our time together, it had always been him taking the initiative. Now, it was my turn to take the lead. Rebecca nudged my forehead with frustration. I made a silly face at her, laughing joyfully. "It's not easy to meet someone you like, and even if it's a dead end, I still want to give it a try." With the financial help from the Hu family, the company quickly got back on track. My mind also started to become more active. I heard that Steve has been extremely busy lately, so I didn't want to disturb him too much, but I would occasionally message him. Fluffy clouds, the first hint of green on the trees, and the cats on the way home. How he used to message me 3 years ago, I was now learning how to message him. But Steve rarely replied to me, or you could even say he didn't reply at all. Even when I tried to invite him out for dinner, he coldly turned me down. Despite my determination, I couldn't help but feel a bit discouraged. During the final meeting with the Hua family, Kathy was also there. Her hair was a bit longer now, tied halfway up, giving her a youthful look. When Rebecca handed her a pen to sign something, their fingertips brushed. Kathy looked up and said, "Thank you." She glanced at the name tag in front of Rebecca and smiled, "Miss Rebecca." Rebecca blushed and hurriedly said she would go make a cup of coffee, then quickly ran out. Kathy leisurely closed the file. "I have some other business, so I'll be leaving." Only when you have close contact with someone do you realize how strong their aura can be. With only the two of us left in the office, I awkwardly stood up and asked, "Should I walk you out?" "No need," Kathy replied with a smile. As we passed by each other, she said in a low voice without looking back, "Wait a little longer." Wait for what? Everyone seems to be playing riddles here. I was getting impatient. My thoughts were in disarray, and I wanted to go find Kathy and get some answers. I quickly went downstairs, but she was nowhere to be seen. At that moment, a man in black appeared from the street corner and stopped me. In a hoarse voice, he said, "Miss Coco, Steve wants to see you." "Steve? He's looking for me?" Tick-tock, the sound of dripping water, like a small hammer striking in my hazy mind. I suddenly woke up, opening my eyes. I saw a desolate and dilapidated scene, with various rusty old machinery scattered around. I quickly realized that I was in an abandoned warehouse. I tried to move, but found my hands and feet tightly bound, struggling to break free. Something was wrong with that man in black. My heart grew cold at the realization. I had hesitated to get in the car following my intuition. But before I knew it, the man in black had struck me on the head, knocking me unconscious. I sighed, resigned to my kidnapping. "Is anyone there?" I tentatively called out. The warehouse seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, eerily silent. My voice echoed, with no response from anyone. I started trying to untie the rope around my wrists, using the chair legs. After some time, I heard a strange roar from outside the door. "Steve, release my brother, or I'll kill your woman." The man's voice was furious. "Your woman is in my hands now. If you don't release my brother, I'll kill her," he shouted, bursting into the room in anger. The setting sun streamed in, casting a menacing light on his face. I felt my breath catch, a sense of danger surging through my spine. Sure enough, he pulled out a small knife and pressed it against my neck, glaring at me. "Scream! Call for Steve to save you." When I remained silent, he brought the knife closer, cutting a shallow gash on my neck. I winced in pain. "We can talk, no need for this. Even if you kidnap me, it won't make a difference. Steve doesn't care about me. He wouldn't bat an eye even if I died." The man's eyes widened with red blood vessels showing. "You're the only girlfriend Steve ever talked about. He definitely can't forget you." I looked up in shock. How did this man know about me and Steve's past? It seemed like my gaze pleased him. He chuckled, "I know more than you can imagine." This time, his knife got even closer. The sharp pain spread, blood flowing, and I shivered with cold. "Steve, I'll count to 3. If you don't release my brother, I'll kill her. I'm going to die anyway. Taking your woman with me before I go would be worth it." The man's tone was manic, grip on the knife trembling. I struggled to keep my head up. "Steve," he yelled. "You lied to me. I'm going to kill her." He threw his phone away, brandishing the knife and lunging towards me. In that critical moment, I just managed to twist my body aside. The next moment, the warehouse door burst open with a bang. Steve stood there, covered in dust, looking almost devilish. Suddenly, his gaze froze. He felt a sharp pain in his chest. I looked down and saw the knife embedded in my side. Blood spilled, a crimson mess on the floor. Steve's expression turned from shock to fear, becoming the last image I saw before descending into darkness. When that scene replayed in my mind before I blacked out, I suddenly jolted awake. "Steve!" The sound of beeping machines replaced the man in black's sharp curses. Before I could fully grasp the situation, a pair of hands tightly held mine. "Coco, I'm here." Steve's voice was almost pleading. He tentatively touched my face and ran his fingers through my hair. The pain and agony in his gaze transformed into surprise and unease. I blinked slowly, wanting to ask many questions. But my post-surgery body was weak and drowsiness enveloped me. Coco, just sleep peacefully, Steve said, tucking me into I'll explain everything to you. I fell back asleep, not knowing how long I slept out. When I woke up again, Kathy was busy in front of me. She covered Rebecca, who was deeply asleep, with a coat and poured chicken soup from a thermos. Drink this, Steve made it himself. I looked at the bowl of fragrant chicken soup. It was rich and savory, with the scum thoughtfully skimmed off. I touched my stomach, taking small sips and lost in thought. The familiar taste, Steve's cooking was as good as ever. Seeing me silent, Kathy seemed a bit anxious. She scratched her head. Aren't you going to ask me what happened? I looked up at her. Kathy sighed and recounted the events that led to this moment. It turned out that on the night of the dock incident, Steve discovered there was a mole among them. After several rounds of secret investigation, they only caught a small lackey who inadvertently exposed himself. With enemies in the dark and him in the light, Steve interrogated while increasing security. No wonder for the past 2 to 3 weeks, I had a vague feeling of someone following me. To ensure nothing went wrong, he even staged a scene at the dinner party, publicly displaying his disdain for me and saying harsh words in an attempt to keep me away from him. Steve wanted to show that Coco was not important to him to avoid alerting the mole. But despite all precautions, a misstep occurred. Kathy placed her hand on her chest. Luckily, I had secretly placed a tracker on you. If it weren't for that, Steve would have gone mad. While negotiating with the mole to buy time, his expression was terrifying. She then quickly added, he's out wrapping up things these days, not deliberately avoiding seeing you. At the doorway, the figure that had been standing there for who knows how long wavered. I softened my tone. Steve, aren't you coming in? Upon hearing my words, Steve froze in front of my bed like a wind-up robot, his steps stiff. He squatted down and whispered, Coco, I'm sorry. On the other side, Kathy hurriedly led the still slightly drowsy Rebecca out before leaving, making sure to close the door behind her. The hospital room was now left with only Steve and me. His broad shoulders slumped slowly. Coco, I shouldn't have kept it from you. But I was just so scared that he wouldn't kill me but would come after you instead. I pondered for a moment before saying, hasn't someone told me before that there should be no deception between lovers? He looked at me, his expression slightly bewildered. Steve, do you love me? I do, he hurriedly responded, as if afraid I would get angry if he hesitated. And would you mind if I had killed your sister? He held my hand tightly and shook his head. Her death has nothing to do with you, Coco. Her death was because of those disgusting animals. Steve's tone turned cold, but it doesn't matter, I've already avenged Shirley. He paused and came to wipe away my tears. It was only then that I realized my vision was blurry. Steve, all this time I thought I was the one who caused her death. If I had answered the phone, would she still be alive? The emotions that had been suppressed for so long overwhelmed me. Countless nights I had been trapped in the swamp of guilt. Steve gently said, Coco, you didn't harm her, you saved her. In her world, there was a moment of beauty, and that was what you gave her. I collapsed onto Steve's shoulder, unable to speak through tears. The shackles of the heart not dissolved bit by bit in the sunlight. After a while, I roughly wiped my tears on him. All right, now it's your turn to ask me. Steve's tone was surprisingly cautious. Coco, do you mind that I kept this from you? Yes, I do. I took a deep breath. Steve, I'm not a child, and I'm not a wallflower who needs your protection. I want to walk beside you, sharing pain and happiness together, not simply be protected by you. That's not the kind of love I want. Steve was startled, then suddenly smiled. Got it. Coco, does this mean you like me too? Was that the main point of all this? But facing his hopeful gaze, I reluctantly nodded. Steve avoided my wound, gently pulled me in. Coco, I like you too. No, I love you. My gaze lingered on his waist for a moment. And I also embraced him back. Steve said he would be honest, but in the end, he still concealed his injury. When he saw me hurt, his first reaction wasn't to subdue the traitor, but to save me. When Kathy and the others rushed in, he had a cut on his waist while the traitor lay lifeless not far away. The accompanying doctor wanted to attend to his wound, but pale-lipped Steve stopped him, saying, I'm fine, check on her first. Thankfully, I had turned my body at the time. The knife didn't hit a vital spot, but I remained unconscious for several days until waking up just these past 2 days. Coco, will you marry me? Steve's voice was gentle and affectionate. The warm sunlight poured in through the window. I sniffed softly and murmured, yes. Now, there is nothing standing in our way. Steve and I will keep walking together, always, until eternal rest.